Ethan Turner had everything anyone could dream of: a luxurious mansion, an extensive collection of high-end cars, and a successful tech company that thrived under his meticulous, if not somewhat ruthless, control. But to those who worked for him, Ethan was not a person of compassion or understanding. His approach to life, and the people around him, was calculated, distant, and often unforgiving. It was no different from Molly, the young nanny he had hired a few months earlier to care for his 6-year-old son, Lucas. For Ethan, Molly was simply another employee, just like any other house staff member. He'd never bothered to learn much about her. He didn't even know her last name, nor did he care to. To him, she was someone whose presence was only meant to serve a function, no more, no less. She was supposed to be invisible, blending into the background, attending to her duties without ever bothering him. And, to her credit, Molly did just that. Molly was a petite, quiet young woman with soft brown hair that she always wore tied back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were modest, and she rarely spoke unless spoken to, which suited Ethan just fine. He didn't have time for small talk or personal conversations. In his eyes, Molly was one of those people who drifted through life on the sidelines, without ambition or a grand story. If she had any kind of personal life or dreams, Ethan didn't care to know. His son, Lucas, had always been a reserved child. Losing his mother at an early age had left him with a shyness that Ethan could never understand. Ethan had tried, in his way, to be there for Lucas, but his efforts usually amounted to little more than awkward attempts at conversation or expensive gifts that the boy never seemed particularly interested in. It was, Ethan reasoned, better to leave Lucas in the capable hands of someone like Molly, someone who seemed gentle and could fill in where he himself felt lacking. The first few weeks after Molly's arrival had passed smoothly. She seemed capable and efficient, always prepared to anticipate Lucas's needs and handle his occasional outbursts with a calm demeanor Ethan admired, though he would never admit it. She read to him, played games, and made sure his afternoons were filled with the kind of quiet joy Ethan felt unable to provide. One evening, Ethan found himself in the kitchen, catching a rare moment of Molly and Lucas laughing together over a simple game they had invented involving nothing more than crayons and sheets of paper. He frowned slightly, wondering what could be so amusing, and walked in without a word. The laughter stopped, replaced by Molly's respectful nod and Lucas's sudden, embarrassed silence. Ethan muttered something about needing a glass of water, barely acknowledging them, and left, his own son's laughter quickly fading from his thoughts. But Molly had noticed. She had seen the small but telling reactions of Lucas whenever his father was near. The way he stiffened or fell quiet, the way his little hands would fidget, and how his eyes would dart around nervously. And while Ethan Turner may not have taken note, Molly did. She sensed the void in Lucas's life, the unspoken longing for connection that was often masked by his father's indifference. Despite her quiet nature, Molly took her role in Lucas's life seriously. She knew the weight of loss herself, having endured hardships that had shaped her into the person she was today. But Ethan never saw any of that. All he saw was an employee who took orders, who fulfilled her duties without complaint, and who, thankfully, didn't cause any trouble. In his mind, she was no different from the other staff, someone he paid to do a job and someone who should never ask for more than that. One evening, Ethan passed by Lucas's room, where Molly was helping him with his schoolwork. Their voices were soft, barely audible, but Ethan felt an odd twinge as he caught snippets of their conversation. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something in the way Molly spoke to his son, something that felt more caring, more genuine than he had ever managed himself. Ethan shrugged off the feeling, attributing it to his own stress and long hours at work, then retreated to his study without another thought. Molly continued her quiet work, content with the boundaries she had with her employer. She was used to people underestimating her, assuming she was a nobody, someone without dreams or struggles of her own. What Ethan didn't know was that Molly's life was much more complex than he could imagine. Her job as Lucas's nanny was more than a paycheck, it was a necessity, a means to an end she would do anything to achieve. Ethan might never know the sacrifices she made or the silent burden she carried, and Molly preferred it that way. She needed this job, and she was determined not to let anything, especially her employer's arrogance, get in her way. In Ethan's world, money equaled worth, and success determined value. Molly didn't fit his criteria, and he couldn't understand why someone would choose to work for him if they didn't have to. Yet, even with all his wealth and status, Ethan couldn't grasp the richness of resilience, the silent dignity with which Molly carried herself, or the depths of her own struggles. Their lives were intertwined by circumstance, bound by nothing more than employment. Or so Ethan thought. But life has a way of blurring the lines between what we think we know and what we can't yet see. And little did Ethan realize that the invisible walls he'd built around himself were about to start crumbling, revealing a side of Molly and himself that he never expected to see. The week had been particularly draining for Ethan, filled with endless meetings and high-stakes negotiations. He returned home earlier than usual one drizzly afternoon, seeking refuge from the ceaseless demands of his job. As he walked through the dimly lit foyer, the soft murmur of voices drew his attention. Curiosity, mingled with a slight irritation, pulled him toward the direction of Lucas's room. Pausing at the half-open door, he glimpsed Molly sitting on the floor with Lucas, who appeared to be lying down, curled up on her lap. She held a small, worn journal in her hands, her voice soft as she read aloud. Her tone was steady, but Ethan noticed a hint of vulnerability he hadn't expected, a rawness that seemed to brush away her usual professional composure. He was about to step in, to reprimand her for wasting time reading to his son when she was supposed to be working. But as he lingered at the doorway, a snippet of her words froze him in place. "I know it's hard, Abby," she read softly, her voice carrying a warmth Ethan found inexplicably captivating. "But I'll do everything I can to make sure you're okay. I promise, even if it means I have to work 100 hours a week. I'll make sure you have what you need. I'll never let you down." Her voice caught slightly, and Ethan felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest. Abby. The name seemed important. Ethan's mind raced with curiosity, questioning who Abby was and why Molly would be reading such a personal, vulnerable entry from her own diary to his son. He watched as Lucas, nestled close, listened intently, his small hands gripping Molly's sleeve as if her words somehow comforted him, too. Molly placed the journal down, stroking Lucas's hair as she murmured, "You know, Lucas, sometimes we have to be strong, even when it's tough. But we don't have to do it alone. You can always talk to me if you feel scared or sad, okay?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat, a mix of awe and confusion running through him. He knew Lucas had always been a quiet, sensitive child, often hesitant to speak openly, especially with him. Yet here was Molly, reaching his son in ways he'd never managed. In that moment, Ethan felt the full weight of his absence in Lucas's life, the distance he'd placed between them without meaning to. As he listened, Ethan realized that Molly's words weren't just comforting for his son, they had an effect on him, too. Her quiet resilience, her promise to this mysterious Abby, it all struck a chord he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. There was something profoundly genuine in her commitment, something that made him feel, for the first time, a flicker of respect for her. Ethan quickly moved away from the door, retreating down the hallway to avoid being seen. He found himself in his study, absently tapping his fingers on his polished mahogany desk as he tried to dismiss the nagging feeling Molly's words had left with him. He was unsettled, partly annoyed that he'd allowed himself to eavesdrop, and partly, well, moved. He shook his head, scoffing at himself. "Why should I care?" he muttered. She was an employee, paid to care for Lucas and nothing more. Her problems were none of his concern, and whatever this Abby business was, it was her private life, irrelevant to his own. And yet, he couldn't shake the image of her sitting with his son, sharing a part of herself with him in such a gentle, almost maternal way. He hadn't known that Molly carried such a heavy weight. It was easy to overlook the sacrifices others made when he'd been raised to believe that everyone was ultimately responsible for their own success. That night, Ethan lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as her words replayed in his mind. He found himself wondering who Abby was, what kind of struggle Molly faced, and why she was willing to go to such lengths for someone else. The more he thought about it, the more he felt a strange, nagging sense of respect that unsettled him. He had always dismissed people like Molly, assuming they lacked ambition or simply settled for less in life. But now, he wasn't so sure. As the days went on, Ethan found himself paying closer attention to Molly whenever she was around. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way she moved quietly through the house, her steady patience with Lucas, and the calm resilience that seemed to follow her like a shadow. It was as though her presence radiated a quiet strength, one that Ethan found himself inexplicably drawn to, despite his attempts to ignore it. One afternoon, as Molly was helping Lucas with his homework in the living room, Ethan entered to grab a file he had left on the coffee table. She looked up, offering him a polite smile, but he caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a flicker of weariness she tried hard to conceal. It was brief, but unmistakable. He wanted to ask her about it, to understand more, but the words never came. Instead, he simply nodded curtly and left, the unspoken question lingering in his mind. For the first time, Ethan was beginning to see Molly as more than just the nanny. She was someone with her own battles, someone who cared deeply and gave selflessly, even when no one was watching. And in a way that surprised him, he found himself wanting to know more. Perhaps it was because she seemed to offer something he himself could not provide, a warmth, a sense of security that Lucas clearly cherished. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because he sensed a quiet strength in her, one that he had never taken the time to see before. By the end of the week, Ethan could no longer deny that something had shifted. He didn't fully understand it, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. But there was no escaping the fact that Molly's quiet resilience had left a mark on him, one he couldn't easily ignore. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the faint stirrings of empathy. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew that Molly had shown him a glimpse of something he'd long forgotten, a reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to life than success and wealth. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself watching Molly more closely, his curiosity simmering beneath a controlled exterior. Despite his best efforts to keep his interest hidden, he couldn't ignore the questions that had begun to gnaw at him, spurred on by the few fragments he had overheard. There was something about Molly's quiet determination, her willingness to go above and beyond, that felt out of place, even inspiring, in a way he hadn't anticipated. Ethan's usual interactions with Molly were brief and functional, no more than polite exchanges about Lucas's schedule or his behavior. Yet now, with a renewed focus, he noticed the small gestures and sacrifices she made daily without ever complaining. Like how she spent her own money on small gifts for Lucas or stayed later than required just to make sure he was comfortable and settled. She had an unspoken dedication that he had never thought to appreciate, let alone acknowledge. One late afternoon, Ethan happened to come home while Molly and Lucas were in the garden. As he parked, he saw them from his car window. Molly crouched beside Lucas as he inspected a caterpillar crawling along a branch. They were both laughing, their voices mingling in a way that sounded so warm. Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Jealousy? Regret? Whatever it was uncomfortable. That evening, he found himself pacing in his study, unable to concentrate on the pile of documents waiting on his desk. He could still hear their laughter in his mind, replaying like a soft melody he couldn't quite shake. Deciding he needed a distraction, he reached for his phone and began scrolling through the photos the housekeeper had taken for insurance purposes, a record of each room and item in his home. As he swiped through, a photo caught his eye. It was of Lucas's room, but in the corner was Molly's small notebook lying on a table, with a carefully placed pen beside it. Ethan felt a surge of curiosity. The notebook was the same one she'd been reading from, the one that held that promise to Abby. Before he could think better of it, he left his study and walked down the hallway, his steps carrying an uncharacteristic hesitance. He opened Lucas's door and found the notebook exactly where he'd seen it in the photo. Picking it up, he traced his fingers over the worn cover. It felt wrong to invade her privacy, yet his need to understand outweighed his guilt. He opened the first page, and in small, neat handwriting, he read, "Dear Abby, I know it's hard. I know it's scary. But I'll be here, no matter what. I'll do anything to make sure you're okay, to give you the life you deserve." He paused, his heart beating faster as he continued to read about the lengths Molly had gone to for this Abby. She had taken on 3 different jobs, barely sleeping and sacrificing her own ambitions, all to ensure this person's well-being. It dawned on him that Abby must be someone very close to Molly, perhaps a sibling, someone she cared for deeply and selflessly. As he turned the pages, he learned that Abby was, in fact, Molly's younger sister. A shiver ran down his spine as he read Molly's words detailing the financial and emotional toll her sister's illness had taken on her. The entries described sleepless nights, days filled with worry, and the constant fear of not being able to afford the treatments Abby desperately needed. Ethan felt a pang of guilt for all the assumptions he had made about Molly, all the times he had dismissed her as just the nanny, never imagining the struggles she faced outside his home. Closing the notebook, he sat down on Lucas's bed, staring at the closed cover as if it held the answers to all his questions. For someone like Molly to give up her own dreams, to put someone else's well-being above her own in such a profound way, it was a concept Ethan found difficult to grasp. It wasn't that he didn't understand sacrifice, but the idea of doing so with no expectation of reward, purely out of love and responsibility, felt foreign to him. Later that night, he lay awake, haunted by what he'd read. He was deeply unsettled, his mind racing with memories of Molly's quiet strength, her unwavering patience, and her gentle nature with Lucas. It was as though he'd been given a glimpse into a side of humanity he had never fully understood. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd been wrong all these years, if perhaps wealth and success weren't the only measures of a person's worth. Ethan found himself reflecting on his own life. His relentless pursuit of financial security and status had cost him relationships, including the distance that now lingered between him and Lucas. He thought about his own childhood, raised in a world where value was tied directly to achievement and wealth. But in Molly's story, he saw a different kind of value, one that wasn't measured by money or power. It was raw, unfiltered sacrifice, something that humbled him in a way he wasn't prepared for. The following day, he couldn't bring himself to look at Molly the same way. He avoided her gaze, feeling an uncomfortable mixture of shame and admiration. For the first time, he wanted to help her, to ease the burden she carried, though he wasn't sure how to go about it. Ethan felt as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a part of himself that had long been buried under layers of cynicism and pride. He found himself wondering if he could ever be capable of the kind of love and dedication Molly showed, not just to her sister, but to Lucas and, in a way, to everyone around her. As he sat at his desk, pretending to focus on the numbers and contracts before him, he felt a strange sense of resolve building within him. For years, he had lived by one guiding principle, that every man or woman was responsible for their own success. But now, for the first time, he questioned the validity of that belief. Molly's story had shown him that sometimes, people did need a helping hand, not because they weren't capable, but because life was, at times, overwhelmingly difficult. Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers. He knew he couldn't change his past actions, nor could he erase the years he'd spent prioritizing wealth over relationships. But maybe, just maybe, he could start to change now. He resolved to do something meaningful for Molly, something that could give her a reprieve from the weight she carried. He wasn't sure yet how he would go about it, but one thing was certain: he could no longer sit idly by, pretending he didn't know the truth. With a deep breath, he stood and made his way toward the door, a newfound purpose simmering within him. Molly had unknowingly opened his eyes to a world beyond his own ambitions. And though he was far from understanding the full scope of selflessness she embodied, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, with her influence, he too could learn to be more than the man he had always been. Ethan's days continued in a strange limbo, his routines unchanged but his perspective altered. Ever since he had read Molly's journal, her words lingered in his mind, mingling with questions he couldn't dismiss. He still tried to maintain a professional distance, but he found himself observing her interactions with Lucas in a way he never had before. The warmth, the patience, and the gentle encouragement she provided, it was all so foreign to him. One evening, Ethan arrived home just as the sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow across the backyard. As he walked past the large bay windows, he noticed Molly and Lucas sitting on the ground, surrounded by crayons, colored pencils, and scattered sheets of paper. Molly was showing him how to draw a tree, her hand guiding his as she encouraged him to explore his creativity. Lucas's face was lit with excitement, his shyness momentarily forgotten. For a brief moment, Ethan felt an urge to join them, to kneel beside his son and join in the simple joy of creating. But he stopped himself, watching from a distance, an outsider in his own family's life. He hadn't realized until that moment how disconnected he had become from Lucas, how little he understood about his son's world. Lucas leaned into Molly, showing her his latest drawing, a lopsided tree with bright green leaves. "Look, Miss Molly," he said proudly, his eyes gleaming. "Is it good?" Molly's face lit up as she examined the drawing. "It's amazing, Lucas," she replied, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've got such a great imagination. I bet if you keep practicing, you'll be even better than me someday." Lucas beamed at her, his little face glowing with pride. Ethan felt a pang in his chest, realizing he had never seen his son look at him with that kind of admiration. For years, he had convinced himself that providing financially for Lucas was enough, that his role as a father was fulfilled by ensuring his son wanted for nothing. But now, watching Molly and Lucas together, he began to understand that there was a void in his son's life, one he had never bothered to fill. As the days passed, Ethan couldn't stop noticing the small ways in which Molly connected with Lucas. He watched her coax Lucas out of his shell, teaching him to express himself, to share his feelings openly. She encouraged him to draw, to read, and to explore his interests without fear of judgment. It was as if she instinctively knew what Lucas needed, filling a gap that Ethan had long ignored. One evening, after dinner, Ethan found himself lingering in the doorway to Lucas's room. Molly was helping Lucas with his bedtime routine, reading him a story as he lay tucked under the covers, his eyes heavy with sleep. Her voice was soothing, weaving a story about bravery and friendship, a story she had clearly told many times before. Lucas listened with rapt attention, his small hands clutching the blanket as he hung on to every word. When the story ended, Lucas looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Miss Molly, do you think I can be brave like that?" Molly smiled, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. "Of course, Lucas. You're already so brave. You have a big heart, and that's what makes you special." Ethan felt his throat tighten as he listened. The reassurance Molly offered his son, the belief she instilled in him, those were things he had never thought to provide. Molly saw Lucas not just as a child to be cared for, but as a person with dreams, fears, and aspirations. And in return, Lucas trusted her in a way Ethan realized he had never earned himself. Later that night, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Lucas looking up at Molly with admiration. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be bought or demanded, it had to be nurtured, earned over time. Watching them, he felt like an intruder, someone who had neglected the most important aspects of fatherhood while focusing on superficial success. The following weekend, Ethan decided to make a small change. When he came home in the late afternoon, he resisted the urge to retreat to his study and instead joined Molly and Lucas in the backyard. Lucas was shy at first, surprised by his father's presence, but Molly greeted him with a smile, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to join them. Lucas hesitated, glancing between his father and Molly. "Daddy, do you want to draw with us?" The simple question took Ethan by surprise, but he nodded, settling down beside his son. Molly handed him a piece of paper and a crayon, her eyes filled with a quiet encouragement that felt oddly reassuring. He was clumsy at first, unsure of what to draw, but Lucas giggled as Ethan tried his best to sketch a cat that ended up looking more like a lopsided blob. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of connection with his son. Molly didn't say much, allowing father and son to bond in their own way. Her presence was steady, a quiet support that made the entire experience feel natural rather than forced. Ethan could sense that she was giving him space to reconnect with Lucas, and he was grateful for it. As the evening drew to a close, Lucas turned to Molly with a shy smile. "Thank you, Miss Molly," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Thank you for helping my daddy draw." Molly laughed, ruffling his hair. "I didn't do anything, Lucas. Your dad did a great job all by himself." Ethan felt his heart swell at her words. She had given him something he hadn't even known he needed, a chance to bridge the gap between him and his son, to find common ground in something as simple as a drawing. In that moment, he realized that Molly's influence extended far beyond the role of a nanny. She was teaching him, showing him how to be a better father, even if she didn't realize it herself. That night, as Ethan tucked Lucas into bed, his son hugged him tightly, something he hadn't done in years. "Daddy, can we draw again tomorrow?" Lucas asked, his voice sleepy but hopeful. Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course, buddy. We can draw whenever you want." As he left Lucas's room, he paused in the hallway, his mind racing with the day's events. He had spent so many years chasing success, believing it would make him a better father, a better provider. But now, thanks to Molly, he was beginning to understand that the greatest gift he could give his son was something far simpler: his time, his presence, his love. Ethan's heart felt lighter as he walked back to his study, a small smile tugging at his lips. He was beginning to see the world through a different lens, one that valued moments over money, relationships over status. And though he knew he still had a long way to go, he felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, with Molly's quiet guidance, he could finally become the father Lucas deserved. Ethan's life continued on its usual path, but the subtle changes in his relationship with Lucas gave his days a new significance. Molly had become an unspoken part of the shift. He found himself looking forward to the moments when he would find her and Lucas working together, knowing that she was building something in his son's life that he hadn't been able to. And as he grew closer to Lucas, he began to notice something else: his own interactions with Molly were also beginning to change. He hadn't thought much of it at first. Their exchanges remained brief and professional, focused on Lucas's activities, meals, and schedules. But every now and then, he would catch himself lingering in their conversations just a moment longer than usual, asking her about her day or offering a rare word of thanks for her dedication. Molly, ever humble, would smile politely and nod, as though accepting his gratitude with a quiet dignity. One afternoon, after an unusually challenging day at work, Ethan arrived home to find Molly in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared Lucas's favorite snack. Her gentle, melodic voice was soothing, filling the house with a warmth it had long lacked. Something about the simplicity of the moment compelled him to step inside, allowing himself to break his usual habit of isolation. "Molly," he said, his voice more casual than he intended. "Thank you for everything. I don't think I've said it enough." Molly looked up, her eyes widening slightly with surprise. For a moment, she seemed uncertain of how to respond, but then she gave him a soft, genuine smile. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Turner. Taking care of Lucas is a privilege for me." Ethan felt a pang of humility, realizing how much he had underestimated her all this time. Her response was sincere, untainted by any expectation or ulterior motive. He wanted to say more, to express the gratitude that was building within him, but he hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the complexity of his feelings. After a brief silence, he nodded, looking away awkwardly. "Still, I appreciate it," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Molly's smile lingered, and Ethan could sense a shift in their dynamic, a growing sense of trust that hadn't been there before. In the days that followed, he found himself confiding in her more often, seeking her insights not just about Lucas but about life, family, and even, occasionally, his own doubts. She was a patient listener, always attentive and thoughtful, never prying or offering advice unless he asked. One evening, as they discussed Lucas's progress in school, Ethan felt a sudden urge to know more about her. He had learned bits and pieces about Abby, her sister, and her determination to support her. But beyond that, her life remained a mystery. He wanted to understand what drove her, what kept her going despite the weight of her responsibilities. "Molly," he began hesitantly, "I know it's probably none of my business, but how do you do it? How do you manage to stay so positive, even with everything on your plate?" Molly looked at him, her expression softening. She seemed to consider his question carefully before responding. "I think, when you care about someone deeply, you find a way. It's not easy, But knowing that I can help my sister, that I can make a difference in her life, that's what gives me strength." Ethan felt a surge of admiration for her, realizing that her strength came from a place of love, a depth of compassion he had never fully understood until now. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was a person driven by a fierce sense of loyalty and responsibility, someone who gave selflessly without expecting anything in return. "I don't think I could do what you do," he admitted, feeling strangely vulnerable. "I mean, I've always believed that people should take care of themselves, that everyone should be responsible for their own lives. But you're different." Molly's smile was tinged with a hint of sadness. "It's not always a choice, Mr. Turner. Sometimes, life doesn't give us that luxury. Sometimes, we have to carry burdens we never expected." Her words lingered in the air, and Ethan felt a deep, unspoken understanding pass between them. In that moment, he realized that she wasn't just speaking about her own life, she was, in her own way, trying to show him a different perspective, one that challenged his long-held beliefs. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself reflecting on the nature of responsibility, of what it meant to truly be there for someone. He had always viewed his role as a father in terms of financial security, providing for Lucas in the most tangible ways. But Molly had shown him that true care, real love, went far beyond material provisions. Over the next few weeks, their conversations continued, each one drawing him closer to a side of life he had long ignored. Molly's influence on Lucas became increasingly apparent as the boy grew more confident, more open, his laughter filling the house with a joy Ethan had rarely heard. And with each passing day, Ethan felt himself growing more connected to his son, more present in ways he had never been before. One day, as they were discussing a recent school project Lucas had completed, Molly turned to him with a look of quiet encouragement. "You know, Lucas talks about you a lot, Mr. Turner. He looks up to you." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. The thought of Lucas admiring him, of wanting his approval, struck a chord he hadn't anticipated. For so long, he had seen himself as an inadequate father, unable to connect with his son on any meaningful level. But here was Molly, reassuring him, reminding him that he had a place in Lucas's life, one that he could still nurture and grow. "Thank you, Molly," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Molly's eyes softened, and she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture that spoke volumes. "You're doing better than you think, Mr. Turner. Lucas loves you, he just needs you to be there, to let him know he matters to you." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. For the first time, he felt a sense of clarity, a newfound understanding of what it meant to be a father. Molly's quiet trust in him, her unwavering belief that he could change, gave him the courage to try. As he left the room, Ethan felt a strange lightness, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be a father. And though he still had a long way to go, he knew he wasn't alone. With Molly's quiet support and the trust they had built, he felt equipped to take on the challenges ahead, one step at a time. Ethan's relationship with Lucas and Molly continued to grow, but his curiosity about Molly's life outside his home remained. He wanted to understand the full extent of her struggles, to know what had driven her to sacrifice so much. But every time he considered asking her directly, he hesitated, unsure if he had the right to pry into her personal life. One evening, Ethan arrived home to find the house unusually quiet. After a moment of searching, he found Molly sitting in the kitchen, her face drawn and tired. Her phone lay on the table, and she was staring down at it, lost in thought. She hadn't noticed him enter, so he paused, observing her as she took a deep, shuddering breath. "Molly," he asked softly, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, and quickly forced a smile. "Mr. Turner. I didn't hear you come in." Ethan could see through her attempt to mask her distress. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying, and there was a weight in her expression that he hadn't seen before. Ignoring the voice in his head telling him to stay out of it, he took a seat across from her, his tone gentle. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his concern evident. Molly hesitated, glancing down at her hands before nodding. "Yes, of course. Just a little tired, that's all." Ethan didn't believe her, but he sensed that pressing her too hard might only make her retreat further. Instead, he waited, hoping that she might feel comfortable enough to share. After a moment, she let out a shaky sigh, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a call with my sister's doctor," she began, her voice tinged with a sadness that cut through Ethan. "Abby's condition is worsening, and they want to start a new treatment. It's very expensive." Ethan's heart sank as he listened. He had known, from her journal and from the few things she'd shared, that her sister was ill. But hearing the pain in her voice brought the reality of her struggle to life in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Is there anything you can do?" he asked, already feeling a pang of regret at how superficial his question sounded. Molly gave a weary smile. "I'm doing everything I can. I've been saving, working extra hours, but it's still not enough. The treatment is experimental, and insurance won't cover it. It's hard knowing there's something that could help her, something that could make a difference, and not being able to afford it." Ethan felt a surge of empathy, mixed with frustration at his own inability to alleviate her burden. He was used to solving problems with money, but he understood that offering financial help without her consent would likely hurt her pride. And he realized that this was more than a simple transaction for her, it was a testament to her love and dedication to her sister, a battle she wanted to face on her own terms. "Molly," he said carefully, "I can't pretend to know what you're going through. But, you don't have to carry this all alone. You're already doing so much for Abby, more than most people would ever be willing to do. It's okay to let someone else help." Molly looked down, a shadow of vulnerability crossing her face. "I've been taking care of Abby since I was old enough to work. I guess I don't know how to let someone else in, even if I wanted to. She's my responsibility, and I don't want to fail her." The depth of her dedication left Ethan speechless. He realized that Molly's identity had been shaped by her commitment to her sister, by years of sacrifice and responsibility. She was someone who gave everything she had, expecting nothing in return, a quality he admired deeply. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her words settling over them. Ethan could feel a shift within himself, a profound respect for her resilience and strength. He wanted to do something, anything, to help, but he knew he had to be careful, to respect her independence and pride. "Molly," he said finally, his voice firm, "I may not understand your journey fully, but I want you to know that I'm here if you ever need support. Not just financially," he added quickly, "but however you need it. I know that probably doesn't mean much, but I mean it." She looked at him, her eyes softened by gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. That means more than you know." Ethan left her that evening feeling both humbled and determined. He couldn't simply sit back and watch her struggle. He knew he needed to find a way to support her in a way that wouldn't diminish her sense of responsibility or independence. The next morning, Ethan made a call to an old friend who worked in the healthcare industry. He explained Abby's situation without mentioning Molly's name, seeking advice on any potential resources or programs that might assist with the treatment costs. His friend promised to look into it, leaving Ethan with a faint sense of hope. Days later, he received a message from his friend. There was a foundation that sometimes provided grants for experimental treatments in cases like Abby's. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance, a way to help Molly without undermining her efforts. That evening, Ethan casually mentioned the foundation to Molly, framing it as something he had heard about in passing. "I don't know if it'll help," he said carefully, "but I thought it might be worth looking into." Molly's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw a hint of relief in her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," she said softly. "I'll definitely look into it. I appreciate this more than I can say." As she turned to go, Ethan felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. Helping her had given him a purpose beyond the confines of his own ambition. And though he knew that her journey was far from over, he felt a quiet confidence that perhaps, in his own way, he could be a part of her support system. In the following weeks, Ethan and Molly's relationship continued to evolve. They shared more conversations, more glimpses into each other's lives, and with each passing day, Ethan felt himself changing. Molly's influence was subtle but powerful, her strength and compassion leaving a lasting impact on him. He realized that she had taught him something he could never have learned on his own, that sometimes, true wealth was found not in material possessions, but in the connections we forge, in the lives we touch. And though he wasn't sure what the future held, he knew one thing for certain: Molly had forever altered the course of his life. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he'd had with Molly. Her quiet resilience, her selfless dedication, it all lingered in his mind, reshaping his understanding of what truly mattered. He was used to navigating a world driven by power and wealth, where success was measured in numbers and influence. But Molly's life, so full of love and sacrifice, had shown him a perspective he had never considered. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, Ethan felt a sudden urge to do more. He knew that simply offering support or sharing resources wasn't enough to truly ease Molly's burden. He wanted to make a real difference, to take a step that would alleviate her worries in a meaningful way. The thought gnawed at him, compelling him to act, despite the voice in his mind that told him he should be cautious. After a moment of contemplation, he reached for his phone and dialed the number of the foundation he had recommended to Molly. He was aware that if she learned he was involved, she might feel uncomfortable, but he was willing to take that risk if it meant helping her in the way she truly needed. As he spoke to the foundation representative, he explained Abby's situation, offering to cover any additional costs not covered by the grant if the foundation approved her application. By the end of the call, a plan was in place, discreet, yet powerful. The following day, Ethan waited with bated breath, wondering if he'd made the right decision. Part of him felt uneasy, fearing Molly might feel betrayed if she discovered his involvement. But his desire to help her outweighed his doubts. He reminded himself that this was about giving her peace of mind, about showing her that she didn't have to face everything alone. 2 weeks later, Molly came into the kitchen, her face lit up with a rare, radiant smile. Ethan was seated at the counter, casually reading the newspaper, but he sensed her excitement before she even spoke. "Mr. Turner," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I just received a call from the foundation. They approved the grant. Abby will be able to start her treatment next month." Ethan looked up, feigning mild surprise. "That's wonderful news, Molly," he replied, keeping his tone measured. "I'm so glad they came through for you and Abby." Molly's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by relief. "I can't believe it," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "This is everything I hoped for. I don't even know how to express how grateful I am." Ethan watched her, feeling a quiet satisfaction that went beyond anything he had experienced in his professional life. Seeing her relief, her joy, made him realize just how much he had come to care about her happiness. This wasn't just about helping her, it was about showing her that she wasn't alone, that someone believed in her and wanted to support her journey. Over the next few days, Ethan noticed a new lightness in Molly's demeanor. She seemed more relaxed, more at ease, and her bond with Lucas only deepened. They spent hours together, laughing and playing, and Ethan could see the joy radiating from his son as he thrived in the warmth of her care. Watching them, he felt an unexpected pang of envy mixed with gratitude. Molly had brought something into his home that he had never been able to provide, a sense of family, a place of comfort and safety. One afternoon, as he was leaving for work, he paused by the door, watching Molly and Lucas as they played a board game on the living room floor. Lucas was laughing, his face bright with happiness, and Molly's eyes sparkled with joy. In that moment, Ethan realized something that took him by surprise. He wanted this warmth, this closeness, not just for Lucas, but for himself as well. That evening, Ethan found himself in a reflective mood. He thought about the sacrifices Molly had made, the love she had shown his son, and the impact she had had on his life. He had come to realize that Molly wasn't just a caregiver, she was a part of their family, someone who had filled a void he hadn't even known existed. The next morning, Ethan approached Molly as she was preparing breakfast. She looked up, smiling, but he could see the hint of curiosity in her gaze, sensing that he had something important to say. "Molly," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just want to thank you. Not just for everything you've done for Lucas, but for everything you've done for me as well. You've shown me a side of life I never thought I'd understand." Molly looked at him, her eyes softening. "Mr. Turner, I don't know what to say. I'm just happy to be here, to be a part of Lucas's life." He nodded, his throat tightening. "You're not just a part of his life, Molly. You're a part of mine too. And I want you to know that whatever happens, you'll always have a place here." Molly's eyes filled with gratitude, and Ethan could see the impact his words had on her. For a brief moment, they stood in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. It was a moment of connection, one that transcended words and formalities, a bond forged through shared struggles and mutual respect. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Helping Molly, connecting with his son, and opening his heart to the possibilities beyond his ambition, it was all transforming him in ways he hadn't expected. He knew he still had much to learn, but with Molly's presence in his life, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future not just defined by success, but by the relationships he had built, the people he had come to care for. And though he wasn't sure where this journey would lead, he knew one thing for certain: Molly had changed him, and he would never be the same. The days continued with a newfound sense of calm. Ethan felt more content than he had in years, and it seemed Lucas and Molly noticed the change too. The household had taken on a warm, almost familial atmosphere. Yet, despite the happiness, Ethan harbored a quiet worry: what would happen if Molly discovered his involvement with the Foundation's grant? Would she feel betrayed, or would she understand his intentions? One evening, Molly was helping Lucas with his bedtime routine when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw the number of the Foundation's representative who had approved Abby's grant. Thinking it was a quick update, she answered with a soft hello, unaware that Ethan was nearby, heading to his study. As Molly listened, her expression shifted from confusion to surprise, her eyebrows knitting as she tried to process what she was hearing. The representative explained that Ethan Turner had been instrumental in securing the grant, not just by connecting her with the Foundation, but by offering his own resources to cover the additional costs if needed. The conversation ended, and Molly stood still, her mind racing. She hadn't known that Ethan was involved at this level. The grant had felt like a blessing, a miraculous answer to her prayers, and she'd never considered that he might have had a hand in it. She felt a mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, but also a sense of vulnerability, unsure of how to process his gesture. For someone as fiercely independent as Molly, accepting help was not easy. The fact that he had done it quietly, without telling her, made it all the more complicated. Molly put Lucas to bed, her mind still spinning as she replayed the revelation. She had always respected Ethan, especially as she saw him grow closer to Lucas, but this was something she hadn't expected. She realized that his intentions went far beyond his role as her employer. He cared, not just for Lucas, but for her, in a way she hadn't anticipated. Determined to confront him, she made her way downstairs and found him in his study, reading over some documents. Ethan looked up when she entered, his expression softening as he noticed the serious look on her face. "Molly," he began, but she cut him off, her voice calm but firm. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Ethan's face grew solemn, and he set the papers down, searching for the right words. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't have accepted it if you knew I was involved. I wanted to help, but I didn't want to take away your sense of accomplishment or make you feel indebted." Molly's gaze softened as she listened, her initial apprehension melting away. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine care behind his decision. Ethan had always been direct, but in this instance, he had shown a rare, considerate side that she hadn't expected. "You were right," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "If I had known, I probably wouldn't have accepted it. But, thank you, Ethan. You don't know how much this means to me." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he realized she understood. "You've given so much, Molly, not just to Lucas, but to this entire house. You've changed things here in ways I can't even explain." I wanted to do something, anything, to repay you." Molly's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I never expected anything in return. I came here to work, to support my sister. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that." They stood in silence, a profound understanding passing between them. For Ethan, it was a moment of vulnerability, an acknowledgement of the bond they had developed. And for Molly, it was a reminder that sometimes, opening her heart to others didn't mean giving up her independence, it meant allowing others to care for her in return. As she turned to leave, Ethan called out softly, "Molly, thank you for trusting me. And for everything else." She paused, her hand resting on the doorframe, and turned back with a gentle smile. "Thank you for believing in me. I won't forget it." That night, Molly lay awake, reflecting on how much her life had changed since coming to work for Ethan. She had been so focused on survival, on carrying her burdens alone, that she hadn't allowed herself to rely on others. Ethan's gesture was more than a financial lifeline, it was a reminder that even in her strength, she didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself. As the days passed, their relationship continued to evolve, no longer defined by titles or boundaries. Ethan found himself valuing Molly's presence more than he could have anticipated. She was no longer just the woman who took care of Lucas, she had become someone he trusted, someone he respected in ways he hadn't expected. Molly, too, found herself opening up, not just to Ethan, but to Lucas as well. She shared more of herself, her joys, her dreams, even her vulnerabilities. It was liberating, a release she hadn't realized she needed, and in return, Lucas adored her even more. The house that had once been cold and empty now felt warm and alive, filled with laughter, understanding, and a closeness none of them had anticipated. Through it all, Ethan couldn't help but feel grateful. He had spent years chasing after success, thinking that wealth and power would bring him fulfillment. But Molly had shown him a truth that no amount of money could buy, that the greatest treasures were often found in the connections we forged, in the people we let into our lives. By the time he retired to his study that evening, Ethan felt at peace, a quiet joy settling over him as he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this place. He had been given a second chance, not just with Lucas, but with himself, to become a better father, a better man. And though he knew there would still be challenges ahead, he felt ready to face them, knowing he wasn't alone. As he turned off the light and closed his office door, Ethan felt a profound gratitude for the family he had found in the most unexpected way. And he knew, deep down, that they had all been changed, transformed by the simple act of opening their hearts. With the revelation of Ethan's quiet intervention behind them, a renewed sense of understanding blossomed between him and Molly. Their relationship now carried a sense of trust and respect that had transformed what once was strictly professional into something undeniably closer. Molly noticed it in small ways, the way Ethan's eyes softened when he looked at Lucas, the way he included her in decisions about the household, and, most of all, the way he was gradually becoming the father Lucas needed. Ethan's transformation was gradual but steady. He made a point to spend more time with Lucas, not just as a duty but as something he truly enjoyed. He would join in on board games, laugh at Lucas's silly jokes, and listen to his stories about school. In these moments, he felt a connection he hadn't thought possible, a bond that had previously been lost in his pursuit of success. And it was Molly who had opened his eyes to it, guiding him with a quiet patience that he had come to deeply respect. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan decided to take Molly and Lucas to the park. It was a spontaneous outing, something he'd never thought to do before, and both Molly and Lucas were surprised yet excited. The day was bright and breezy, and as they arrived at the park, Lucas immediately ran to the swings, laughing with abandon. Ethan stood nearby, watching his son with a smile that spoke of pride and joy. Molly joined him, and they shared a comfortable silence, both observing Lucas's joy. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice thoughtful. "It's strange," he said, almost to himself. "I used to think giving Lucas everything he needed was enough. I thought that if he had all the resources, he'd be fine. But I see now that he needed me. Just me, without the titles or the money." Molly nodded, her gaze warm. Children don't measure love in things, Mr. Turner. They feel it in the time we give, in the little moments. Lucas is lucky to have you. And you're here now, that's what matters. Her words settled over him like a soft embrace, and he felt a surge of gratitude that he couldn't fully express. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability that was rare for him. You've shown me that, Molly. I don't know if I'd have ever realized it on my own. You've given us a family. Molly's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, humbled by his words. She hadn't expected to become so intertwined in their lives, but the Turner household had grown to feel like her own in ways she hadn't anticipated. She cared deeply for Lucas, but she realized that her connection extended to Ethan as well, appreciating the man he was becoming. They spent the rest of the day laughing and playing in the park, a sense of harmony settling over them that felt both natural and precious. Lucas ran back and forth between the two, gleeful at having both Molly and his father by his side. For Ethan, these moments were more fulfilling than any success he'd achieved. Here, with his son and the woman who had transformed his life, he found a contentment that was entirely new. That evening, as they returned home, Lucas fell asleep in the back seat of the car, his small face peaceful and content. Ethan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He turned to Molly, who was seated beside him, her own expression soft as she watched Lucas sleep. "Thank you, Molly," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For helping me become a father." Molly's eyes met his, and she gave a gentle nod. "It's been my privilege, Mr. Turner. You've come a long way." The words hung in the air, a testament to the journey they had taken together. As they carried Lucas inside and tucked him into bed, Ethan felt a wave of peace wash over him. He had found something that money couldn't buy, something that had brought meaning to his life in a way he had never anticipated. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic in the house continued to shift. Ethan and Molly fell into a rhythm, a comfortable partnership built on mutual respect and a shared dedication to Lucas. Ethan consulted her on matters beyond Lucas's care, valuing her insight and perspective. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal, and Ethan found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone before. One evening, as they sat together after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan shared a memory from his own childhood. He told her about his father, a man who had always valued hard work and success above all else. Ethan had grown up in a household that emphasized achievement, where emotions were often brushed aside. But as he spoke, he realized that those values, while they had driven him to success, had also left him with a void he hadn't fully understood until now. "I always thought I'd follow in his footsteps," he admitted, his voice low. "That success and wealth would be enough. But now I see that it's so much more complicated than that." Molly listened, her gaze gentle and understanding. "We all carry things from our past, Mr. Turner. But the beautiful thing is that we can choose to change, to become something more. And you're doing that." Her words resonated deeply with him, and he felt a warmth in her gaze that gave him a quiet strength. She had become a constant in his life, someone he could trust, someone who had seen him at his worst and continued to stand by him. And in that moment, he realized that her presence was no longer just a comfort, it was essential. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude. Molly had helped him rediscover himself, to find a part of him he had lost along the way. She had given him back his son, his sense of purpose, and a peace he hadn't known was possible. The house felt different now, filled with warmth and connection, a place where he felt truly at home. And as he watched Molly leave the room, he knew that he wanted her to remain a part of their lives, not just as a caregiver, but as someone who had become indispensable, someone who had given him and Lucas a family in the truest sense of the word. As the months passed, life settled into a steady rhythm, one that felt balanced and fulfilling in a way Ethan had never imagined possible. The Turner household had become a place of warmth and laughter, where Lucas's giggles filled the rooms, and Molly's gentle presence remained a constant source of comfort and guidance. For Ethan, every day brought new lessons, small moments of joy, and a deepening understanding of the life he had been missing. One evening, after a quiet family dinner, Ethan found himself sitting alone in his study, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this place. He remembered the man he had once been, the businessman driven by ambition and success, who had thought he could fill the gaps in his life with material wealth. But now, looking back, he could see how much he had changed. And he knew, without a doubt, that it was Molly's influence that had opened his eyes and his heart. He glanced at a stack of stationery on his desk, an idea forming in his mind. Carefully, he picked up a pen and began to write, his words flowing with a sincerity he hadn't expected. "Molly," he began, "I don't think I could ever fully express what you've given to me and Lucas. You came into our lives quietly, without expecting anything in return, and in doing so, you changed us both. You've taught me that true strength lies not in wealth or status but in kindness, compassion, and the love we give to others." He paused, considering his words carefully before continuing. "I am forever grateful for the way you've helped me reconnect with Lucas, for showing me how to be a father in ways I hadn't understood. You've given him the warmth, stability, and affection he deserves, and for that, I will always be in your debt. You've given us a family, Molly, something I didn't even know we were missing until you came into our lives." Setting the pen down, he read over the letter, feeling the weight of his gratitude. He decided that he would give it to her the following morning, a small token of appreciation for the profound impact she had made. But as he folded the letter, he felt a tug at his heart, a sense that he needed to say more. That night, after Lucas was in bed, Ethan found Molly in the living room, tidying up as she often did. She looked up as he approached, her expression warm and welcoming. He held the letter out to her, his voice gentle. "This is for you, Molly. Just something I wanted to say." Molly took the letter, her eyes filled with curiosity. She opened it slowly, reading each word with a growing sense of emotion. By the time she finished, her eyes were misty, and she looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, I don't know what to say. This means more to me than you can imagine." He nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. "It's the least I could do. You've given us so much, Molly. I just wanted you to know how much we value you, how much I value you." They stood in silence, a deep understanding passing between them. Ethan reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're part of our family now, Molly. And you'll always have a place here, with us." Molly's smile was soft, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan. I never expected any of this. Coming here was supposed to be just a job. But somewhere along the way, it became so much more. You and Lucas, you both mean the world to me." They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories and memories, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. For Ethan, it was a night of peace and fulfillment, a culmination of everything he had come to value since Molly entered their lives. He knew that whatever the future held, he would never be the same man he had been before. And for that, he was grateful. As the days turned into weeks, life in the Turner household continued with the same warmth and connection that had transformed them all. Ethan became a more present father, finding joy in Lucas's company and pride in his growth. Molly remained a beloved part of their family, her gentle presence a constant reminder of the love and resilience that had brought them together. One sunny afternoon, they found themselves sitting together in the backyard, watching Lucas as he played in the grass. The air was filled with laughter and lightness, a sense of happiness that was simple yet profound. Ethan looked over at Molly, a quiet gratitude filling his heart. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I know that whatever happens, I'm glad we're facing it together. Thank you, Molly. For everything." Molly smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "It's been my privilege, Ethan. And wherever life takes us, I'll always be grateful for this." In that moment, Ethan felt a profound peace settle over him. He had found something he hadn't known he was missing, a family, a sense of purpose, and a love that was quiet but unwavering. And as he watched Lucas play, surrounded by the people who mattered most, he knew that this was the life he had always been searching for. They sat together in companionable silence, content in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful and lasting. And for Ethan, the man who had once defined his life by success and ambition, there was no greater achievement than the family he had found in Molly and Lucas.